Some individuals believe that we cannot study death after it occurs. However, recent research is allowing us to freeze brains and bodies, and there, in fact, is research now that is extending past the last heartbeat and the last recorded activity of our brain. For the concept of our class, we will limit it to the point where our body stops functioning, and that's what we'll define as death. But we will also discuss the bereavement and the process through which those that are left behind have to go through. We find that the experience of death varies from person to person, but more specifically, we've been able to research the experiences as it relates to different groups of people according to their age. Young people, for example, perceive death as a loss of opportunity to experience things and the loss of a family relationships. Sometimes we've heard, even as jokes in movies or by teenagers, they say, I don't want to die a virgin, or I don't want to die without having seen this. And it really kind of encapsulates the idea behind it. Older adults worry more about the loss of time to complete their inner work. So this is middle adulthood, where they may fear at leaving their kids unprotected because they're still very young. Middle-aged adults are most fearful of death than all other age segments, and that is again because of its proximity to it, and also their relative youth. And we find that those that are more likely to fear the period of uncertainty before death than death itself are the older adults. Those that are the closest to it don't fear death. They just fear the uncertainty behind it. Now, we find, according to Erickson, that the lack of ego integrity will result in a greater fear of death and a sense of despair. But again, it's not necessarily death, but it's the sense that they did not accomplish what they were supposed to. According to Kubler-Ross's stages of dying, we all go through these 5 steps here. First, we tend to deny the fact that we are close to it, and then there may be a sense of anger. We may try to bargain with a supreme being, or with the doctors, or with ourselves. There is often a sense of depression after we go through these for 3 other steps, and then there's acceptance. But all throughout, there is a possibility that this is going to be, for example, going from here to here, from here to here, and then from that get back up again and start again. And it is dynamic. It's not step by step by step. You may go 1, 2, and then go back to 1, 1, 2, 3, go back to 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, go back up to 2, and then finally get to acceptance. According to Freud's psychoanalytic theory, we will grieve naturally the death of a loved one, but the ego will protect itself from unpleasant emotions through defense mechanisms that are automatically there. And denial and repression are 2 of the most common ones. The bad thing about this is that these defense mechanisms can only work for so long before they basically break down and allow us to experience what we were supposed to experience to begin with. Now, to avoid mental illness, individuals must examine the emotions and their source directly, and oftentimes this can only be achieved through counseling or through guided counseling, encouraging a person to cry, to experience the grief and express how they're grieving in comparison to others, is encouraged and was in fact influenced by Sigmund Freud. Oftentimes when I worked in therapy, I would have individuals do role play when they had lost loved ones, and have them pretend I was that loved one that had died. And it was through that process of being able to communicate with that person that several sentiments would be let out. And sometimes the sentiments were not necessarily pleasant. Sometimes it was anger. Sometimes there were other emotions that needed to come out and that were healthy for the person to let out. The loss of a loved one is always tough. But we find that there are differences when a spouse loses the other when it comes down to gender. Widowhood has immediate and long-term effects on the immune system. We often find that sometimes the individual's health would be compromised shortly after the loss of a loved one. That typically returns to normal a year after. Now, the depression rises substantially, and this is basically the relationship that's characterized by emotional distance and conflict are more likely to lead to depression than those that were warm. Those relationships that were healthy, that were adequate, they often seem to apart in their separate ways, and they seem to be okay. But those relationships that were difficult, those relationships that were not necessarily healthy, they often bring about a sense of despair and depression as we feel that there's some unfinished business there. Um, Women typically suffer more economically than emotionally in responses to the loss of their husbands or their loved ones, their spouses. Men, for the most part, don't experience a lot of economic losses, but they'll experience the emotional turmoil that's associated with that. When it comes down to grieving, we find that um, symptoms of depression that are brought about by the death of a loved one are normal. But this is considered to be a pathological grief, meaning not necessarily what we would consider within norm when the symptoms last more than 2 months. If the grief symptoms last more than 6 months, then the individual is believed to suffer from long-term depression, and it would no longer be grieving. Again, as mentioned earlier, men are likely to suffer more than women, and the risk of death by men, typically natural causes of suicide, are significantly greater also for men than women. There are different hypotheses behind this difference in this emotional loss, and it mostly points to men feeling lonely and not having someone who has catered to them for so long in marriages where there were uh, a lot of gender stereotypes, the traditional gender stereotypes. Whereas when men broke those gender stereotypes, the sense of loss is argued or believed to be less intense.